The hall was buzzing with energy that afternoon. People moved in small clusters, chatting, laughing, and glancing around at the decorations and the instruments set up on the stage. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, making patterns on the polished wooden floor. Some parents clutched their children's hands, guiding them past tables stacked with flyers and programs. Others wandered alone, notebook in hand, jotting down thoughts or ideas. It was the kind of community event where everyone felt they belonged, yet somehow, almost everyone felt the need to look important while they were there. Among the crowd, a young girl quietly made her way through the hall. She wasn't loud or showy. Her hair, a simple braid over one shoulder, bounced slightly as she walked. Her shoes made soft clicks against the floor, but she hardly noticed the sound. Her eyes were drawn to everything around her, the sunlight, the instruments, the people talking, but she didn't speak to anyone. It wasn't shyness exactly. It was more like she wanted to take it all in before she decided where she belonged. At the far end of the hall, a grand piano stood like a silent, gleaming giant. Its black polished surface reflected the lights above, and its ivory keys looked inviting, almost calling out to anyone brave enough to sit and play. Musicians had gathered near it earlier to tune it, and now it sat empty, waiting for someone to bring it to life. The girl paused for a moment at a distance, staring at the piano. Her hands twitched slightly, almost as if they wanted to move toward it. A group of teenagers nearby noticed her lingering. They were loud, full of the kind of energy that made people either admire them or step aside. One of them nudged the other and pointed at the girl. "Look at her," he said with a smirk. "She thinks she can play or something." The others laughed, not cruelly, but with that easy, careless confidence of someone who assumed they knew everything about everyone in the room. The girl heard the laughter faintly, but she didn't turn away. She felt a mix of nerves and determination. She had been taught to pay attention to music all her life, but in a place like this, surrounded by strangers and people who thought they knew her, it wasn't easy to step forward. Her stomach fluttered. Every step toward the piano felt heavier than the last, but something inside her kept urging her forward. She moved closer. Her eyes didn't leave the keys. She could feel the smoothness of the polished wood through her fingertips even before she touched it. The piano seemed alive, not just a set of keys and strings, but something waiting, breathing, and listening. She imagined the sounds she could create, the stories she could tell, the emotions she could share. For a moment, the hall, the crowd, the laughing teens, all of it disappeared from her mind. It was just her and the piano, and a quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, she could speak through the music. The teens were still watching. One leaned closer and whispered, "She's going to make a fool of herself." Another giggled and said, "I wonder if she even knows what she's doing." Their voices were sharp and careless, designed to sting, and she could feel the weight of them pressing down. She hesitated, her fingers hovering just above the keys. The sound she imagined seemed suddenly fragile, delicate, as if it could break under the wrong touch. Her mind raced back to a memory, her grandfather, sitting beside her in a tiny living room, teaching her to play when she was very young. He had been gentle but firm, guiding her hands, showing her how to listen to the music, to feel it in her chest, to let it come out of her without fear. "Play for yourself," he had said. "Not for anyone else. Let the music tell your story." She could almost hear his voice again, soft but certain, reminding her that she didn't need anyone's approval to share something beautiful. The girl let out a slow breath. She looked around briefly, seeing the crowd, the curious faces, and the teens who had laughed. For a split second, she imagined turning and walking away, letting them continue their mocking whispers. But then her fingers touched the keys, light and tentative at first. The sound that came out was soft, simple, but it carried a weight she hadn't expected. She didn't glance up. She didn't care who was watching. She only cared about the sound, the feel of the piano beneath her hands, and the memory of her grandfather's encouragement. The laughter of the teens faltered. They exchanged glances, surprised that a single note had been played without a mistake. A few of the older attendees who had noticed the girl paused in their conversation. Some leaned forward slightly, curious to see what would happen next. The piano, once a silent object, now seemed alive in the room, humming softly with the first note, as if acknowledging her presence. Her confidence began to grow. She pressed another key, and then another, allowing her fingers to move freely across the keys. The sound was still gentle, but it carried something the room hadn't expected. People stopped talking. They turned their heads toward her, trying to figure out what was happening. There was no rush, no showy flourish, just a girl letting the music flow through her, connecting with something deeper than herself. The teens who had mocked her were caught off guard. Their smirks faded as they watched her. The girl wasn't playing loudly, but there was a precision, a clarity in her notes that made it impossible to dismiss her. Their whispers died down, replaced by a quiet, uneasy attention. She could feel their eyes on her, but it didn't matter. She was no longer playing for them. She was playing for the memory of her grandfather, for the love she had felt for music all her life, and for the courage it took to step forward in a place where no one knew her. Time seemed to slow. Every sound in the hall, the murmur of the crowd, the rustle of programs, the clatter of cups from the refreshment table faded into the background. There was only the piano and the girl's hands moving across the keys. Each note seemed to float in the air, clear and deliberate, yet effortless. It was as if the piano had been waiting for this moment, waiting for someone who understood it enough to bring it to life in a way that demanded attention without force. A few parents near the front leaned in, surprised at how well the girl played. Their children watched with wide eyes, sensing that something special was happening. Even the other musicians, who had been tuning and chatting before, paused to listen. There was a quiet admiration building, subtle but unmistakable, as the girl continued to play. It was not flashy or dramatic. It was honest, pure, and full of emotion. Inside herself, the girl felt a mixture of nervousness and joy. Her heart raced, but not with fear. This was excitement, the thrill of sharing something deeply personal with the world, even if only for a few minutes. She imagined her grandfather smiling beside her, proud and calm. She imagined the music carrying his words into the hall, making the audience understand the story behind the notes. For the first time that day, she felt entirely at peace. The hall had grown quieter still. Conversations had stopped. People who had been moving around the room now stood frozen, watching her. The teens who had mocked her shifted uneasily, unsure how to react. Some looked away, embarrassed by their earlier behavior. Others couldn't stop their eyes from following her hands as they danced across the keys. It was a strange moment, a mix of disbelief, curiosity, and growing respect. The girl's fingers moved with more confidence now. She began to play a short melody she had created herself, inspired by the songs her grandfather had taught her. It was simple, sweet, and haunting, with a rhythm that seemed to echo in the wooden walls of the hall. People felt it in their chest, the way music can reach deep inside without words. The teens who had laughed earlier were silent now, and some of them even leaned forward slightly, captivated despite themselves. It was only the beginning. Just a few minutes in, and already the atmosphere had changed. The hall that had been full of chatter and casual energy now held a quiet tension, a sense that something remarkable was unfolding. People were leaning on chairs, tilting their heads, listening intently. Even those who had never cared much for piano music were drawn in, because it wasn't just music, it was a story, and the girl was telling it in a way that demanded to be heard. Her hands moved more freely, yet each note was deliberate, thoughtful. She didn't rush, and she didn't need to. The music itself carried a rhythm, a flow that made people forget to breathe for a moment. She could feel the eyes on her, but rather than being intimidating, they were encouraging. She realized that music had a way of doing that. It could make strangers feel connected, even if they had doubted you just moments before. The first part of her performance ended with a soft chord. She held it just long enough for it to resonate in the hall, letting the sound linger. Then she lifted her hands slowly, almost shyly. The room stayed silent for a heartbeat longer than expected. People weren't ready to break the spell yet. Even the teens, now slightly ashamed, exchanged glances. It was as if the hall itself had paused to acknowledge the moment. She took a small breath, feeling a quiet pride swell inside her. She hadn't spoken a word, hadn't tried to show off, but she had captured the attention of the room. She had shown herself that she could step forward, even when others doubted her. And more than that, she had brought a part of her grandfather into the moment, honoring the lessons he had taught her and the love he had shared for music. The hall had shifted. What had started as a casual community event with people talking and laughing had transformed in. The hall had quieted down after the girl's first tentative notes, but the murmurs and whispers were far from gone. The teens who had mocked her at the beginning weren't satisfied with just watching. One of them, taller than the rest, and with a loud voice that often drew attention, leaned against a chair and called out, "Hey, what's the big deal? It's just a piano. Anyone can press keys." His friends snickered, nudging each other as if they had just delivered a clever joke. The girl froze for a moment, her fingers hovering above the keys. The words stung, even though she tried not to let them. She could feel the warmth creeping into her cheeks, the familiar tightness in her stomach that always appeared when someone laughed at her. But this time, something inside her resisted. She remembered her grandfather's voice, calm and encouraging. Play for yourself, not for applause. The music is yours first. That thought gave her a tiny spark of courage, enough to steady her trembling hands. She pressed another key, soft at first, then another, letting the melody flow without rush. It was the same simple tune she had started with, but this time she added subtle flourishes, small twists that made the music feel alive. Her fingers moved as if they knew exactly where to go, guided by memory and heart rather than force. The room's attention shifted again. The parents and older visitors leaned in, curious and now genuinely interested. Even a few children stopped fidgeting to watch her play, but the teens were not impressed. "Come on, it's just some notes," one of them muttered, loud enough for others nearby to hear. Another crossed his arms, his face a mix of boredom and disbelief. "I've seen better at school talent shows. She's wasting everyone's time." They exchanged smirks, convinced that they had seen through her act. Certain that her performance would collapse under scrutiny, the girl hesitated, her fingers stopping mid-air. The doubt threatened to creep in. Was she really any good? Maybe they were right. Maybe she didn't belong here. Her hands felt heavy, and for a moment the piano seemed like an enormous wall rather than a friend. But then she took a slow, steadying breath and reminded herself why she was here. She wasn't trying to impress the teens or anyone else in the room. She was here to share something she loved, something that had been a part of her for as long as she could remember. Slowly, she began again. This time, she added a small variation she had learned from her grandfather, a sequence of notes that danced lightly across the keys. It was delicate, precise, and unexpectedly lively. The sound filled the room, not loudly, but with a clarity that seemed to pierce through the murmurs and chatter. People who had been glancing at their phones or chatting with friends now stopped. They turned to listen, realizing that this was no ordinary performance. Something unusual and beautiful was unfolding right in front of them. The teens, however, refused to let go of their disbelief. "She's just lucky," one of them said under his breath, trying to convince himself more than anyone else. "It's a beginner's trick. Anyone could do that by chance." His friend shook his head, still smirking. "Nah, she'll mess up soon. Watch." They leaned back, waiting for the girl to falter, expecting the moment to collapse like a house of cards. The girl noticed them watching, and for a moment, a flash of anger crossed her mind. She could feel her fingers tighten, almost instinctively, as if ready to fight back through her music. But she remembered something her grandfather had taught her. Music wasn't about fighting. It was about expressing, about letting something inside speak louder than words ever could. And so, she let the music flow, softer and gentler at first, then building slowly, letting each note carry her confidence outward. A few more visitors began to take notice. A woman near the side leaned over to her friend, whispering, "Who knew she could play like that? I didn't see her here before." Her friend nodded, her eyes wide, clearly impressed. Others shifted in their seats, some standing to get a better view. Even the musicians who had been tuning their instruments earlier stopped their work to listen, eyebrows raised in curiosity. The girl wasn't just playing. She was telling a story, and people were starting to feel it, even if they didn't know exactly why. The teens grew frustrated. Their confidence, which had seemed unshakable just moments before, began to waver. "She's still playing the same tune," one muttered, trying to dismiss it. "This is nothing." But his voice lacked conviction. Even he could feel the change in the room. The soft hum of her piano had captured attention, had made people stop talking, and even the faintest hint of admiration was creeping into their expressions. The girl noticed the change too. She could sense it in the air, a shift that was almost tangible. The laughter and mockery had lessened, replaced by quiet curiosity, even awe. She pressed a key more firmly, then another, letting the melody grow a little bolder, a little richer. Her confidence built with each note, and her heart began to beat in rhythm with the music. It was as if the piano itself understood her, guiding her hands toward notes that would touch the listeners without her needing to plan it. A few people exchanged glances, whispering to each other. "She's amazing," one said quietly. Another nodded, eyes wide. "I didn't expect that." "Not at all." Even some of the teens, despite themselves, found their expressions softening. They could not look away, could not pretend the music wasn't impressive. Their smirks faded into something closer to astonishment. Though they refused to admit it out loud, the girl's mind drifted again, back to her grandfather. She could almost see him sitting beside her in the small living room where she had first learned to play. His hands, weathered but gentle, had guided hers. He had always told her that mistakes didn't matter if your heart was in the right place. She remembered the afternoons spent learning to listen, to feel the rise and fall of notes, to find emotion in the quiet spaces between sounds. She let that memory guide her fingers now, trusting herself, trusting the piano, trusting the music. She began to play a variation of the melody, one that was more complex, but still delicate. The notes seemed to float in the air, soft and light, yet precise and clear. They wrapped around the listeners like a warm, invisible blanket, capturing attention without demanding it. People leaned in closer, unconsciously holding their breath as they followed her hands moving across the keys. Even the children were quiet now, mesmerized by the sound, eyes wide, fingers tapping softly in rhythm that the teens' whispers became less frequent. They were still there, still watching, but they could not disrupt what was happening. One of them muttered, "Okay, maybe she's not terrible." But even as he spoke, he sounded unsure, almost embarrassed at admitting it. His friend shook his head quickly, pretending he hadn't said anything, and stared at the piano, as if willing it to fail. The girl didn't stop. She continued, letting each note speak for itself, letting the story flow naturally. She didn't rush, she didn't show off, and she didn't worry about the whispers or doubtful looks anymore. Her mind and heart were fully absorbed in the music. Each sound she created carried a little piece of her courage, a little of her joy, a little of the memory of the grandfather who had believed in her long before anyone else did. Gradually, the hall seemed to shrink around her. The walls, the ceiling, even the crowd of people faded into the background, leaving only the piano and her connection to it. She was aware of eyes on her, but they no longer intimidated her. Instead, she felt a quiet pride, a steady determination. She had come here unsure, hesitant, but now she was taking control, shaping the sound into something beautiful and undeniable. A soft gasp from the audience broke the momentary silence. An older man near the back leaned forward, his eyes glinting with surprise. "Remarkable," he whispered to the person beside him. "I didn't expect that from someone so young." Others nodded in agreement. A few people in the crowd even wiped their eyes, touched by the emotion in the music, the delicate honesty of her playing. The girl noticed it, but she didn't stop. She simply let the notes continue, allowing the story she carried inside to unfold naturally. The teens were visibly uneasy now. They had expected her to falter, to make a mistake, to look foolish. None of that had happened. Instead, the girl had transformed the atmosphere, commanding attention without a word, capturing hearts with her fingers and the simple elegance of her music. Their smirks had faded entirely, replaced with a mix of awe, disbelief, and begrudging respect. The girl's hands moved faster now, yet each note remained clear and precise. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, but her skill spoke louder than words could. The crowd leaned in collectively, drawn by the beauty of the performance. The parents, the musicians, even the previously skeptical teens were all silent, listening, watching, feeling. It was no longer just music. It was a story unfolding, a message reaching out to everyone in the hall. A soft smile touched the girl's face. She had faced doubt, mockery, and uncertainty, yet she hadn't stopped. She had let the music speak, and it had answered her, guiding her through a moment that could have been frightening into one of quiet triumph. The hall was no longer just a room with people. It had become a space of connection, of understanding, where the music bridged the gap between performer and audience, between fear and courage. By the time she ended the short piece, a hush fell over the room. People stared at her, some blinking rapidly as if afraid the moment might vanish if they After the soft applause died down, the girl stayed at the piano, her fingers resting lightly on the keys. The hall had shifted in energy. People were no longer talking casually or glancing around. They were watching her with curiosity, a quiet tension in the air, as if waiting for what she would do next. The teens who had laughed earlier stood frozen, unsure of how to react. For a moment, it felt like time itself had slowed, giving her the chance to choose what would happen next. She could feel her heartbeat, steady but strong, like a drum keeping pace with her thoughts. The applause had been kind, yes, but it wasn't the goal. She reminded herself of her grandfather's words again, clear and comforting in her mind. Play for yourself, not for applause. Let the music speak for you. That thought grounded her. She took a slow breath, lifting her hands, and began to move them across the keys once more. This time, the melody was not timid or simple. She let herself expand it, weaving small flourishes that had been waiting inside her for a long time. The first notes carried softly at first, delicate and light, almost like a whisper. The audience leaned in instinctively, drawn by the subtle beauty. Even the people who had been walking through the hall stopped in their tracks, sensing that something special was happening. The teens who had been mocking her earlier frowned, clearly unsettled by the quiet skill they were witnessing. They whispered to each other in disbelief, but their words were weak against the sound of the piano. She played with attention, not to the crowd, but to the music itself. Every note mattered. Every pause, every rise and fall was intentional. She imagined herself telling a story, one her grandfather would have been proud to hear. Memories of him teaching her small melodies at home floated in her mind. The smell of old books and warm tea, the sound of his voice correcting her gently, the feeling of his hand guiding hers on the keys, it all came back in vivid detail. She let it guide her fingers now, and the music became richer, deeper, more alive. People in the audience started to react differently. Some leaned closer to hear the subtle changes in tone. Others whispered to each other softly, pointing to the girl and shaking their heads in surprise. Even the older musicians, who had spent years mastering their own instruments, looked impressed. There was a quiet awe that filled the room, an energy that didn't need words. Everyone could feel that this was more than just a performance. It was a moment of truth, a revelation of someone's hidden talent and heart. The teens who had mocked her were shifting uncomfortably. They exchanged nervous glances, unsure what to do next. Their smirks had vanished entirely, replaced with something that resembled unease and disbelief. One of them muttered quietly, "She's good." Another shook his head, pretending not to have heard, but it was clear that even they could not deny what was unfolding. The girl didn't look at them or react to their whispers. She didn't need their approval. The music was enough, and it carried her forward. Her fingers began to move faster now, but with control. The melody she had started with transformed into something more intricate, something she had only ever dared to play when alone in her room. Each note felt alive, each pause like a breath in a conversation. The music wasn't just a series of sounds, it was an expression of every feeling she had kept inside. Every moment of doubt, every spark of courage, every memory of love and guidance. People were leaning closer now. The parents, the musicians, even the children, all silent, absorbed by the unfolding melody. Some couldn't help but close their eyes, letting the sound fill their hearts. There was a ripple through the audience, an unspoken acknowledgement that what they were hearing was rare and beautiful. It was no longer background noise or entertainment. It was a gift, delicate and powerful at the same time. The girl's confidence grew with each measure. She felt the music carrying her, guiding her hands, and encouraging her to explore. The piano was no longer just a set of keys. It was a partner, a friend, a bridge between her and the people who were beginning to understand her through the language of notes and rhythm. Her hands moved effortlessly now, fingers dancing across the keys, weaving patterns that were both intricate and emotionally touching. A few of the older attendees exchanged whispers, astonished. "She's incredible," one said softly. "I've never seen someone this young play with such depth." Another nodded, his eyes fixed on her hands, following the movement with fascination. It was rare to witness someone who could combine skill with emotion so naturally. The girl didn't pause for recognition. She only allowed herself to feel the music, letting it flow and grow. The teens were now silent. Their earlier mockery had evaporated entirely, replaced by a mixture of awe, envy, and uncertainty. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected the confidence, the control, or the emotion. For once, they could do nothing but watch. They leaned forward slightly, almost instinctively, drawn by the beauty of the performance. Their expressions shifted subtly, from arrogance to respect. Even if grudging, the girl continued, adding subtle pauses that emphasized the melody's rise and fall. Her heart moved with the music, her fingers reflecting every small change in rhythm and tone. The piano seemed to respond to her thoughts, producing sounds she hadn't even planned, but that felt entirely right. She was no longer thinking about the audience, about the teens, or even about herself. She was in the music, and the music was in her. Some of the younger children in the hall were sitting on the floor now, leaning against chairs, captivated by the sounds. Their eyes were wide, their attention total. One little boy whispered to his mother, "She's like magic." His mother nodded, smiling, equally mesmerized. The effect was spreading. People who had been skeptical or distracted were now caught up in the spell she had woven. The hall felt smaller somehow, more intimate, because everyone was sharing the same experience. The girl's fingers moved over the keys with a growing sense of freedom. She began to explore small variations, improvising gently, adding tiny ornaments that gave the music a sense of life and movement. Each note seemed to shimmer in the air, catching the light from the tall windows, floating to the back of the hall, and reaching every corner. The audience could feel the effortlessness of her playing, the clarity of her emotion, and the precision of her skill. Even the parents who had come with their children were impressed. They whispered to each other, acknowledging her talent. "I can't believe someone so young can play like this," one said softly. Another nodded, her eyes still on the girl's hands. "It's like she's been born to play the piano." There was a quiet awe building in the room, the kind that comes when people realize they are witnessing something special. Something rare. The teens shifted again, restless now. They had wanted to see her fail, to laugh, to feel superior, but instead they were watching a performance that left them speechless. Their whispers were gone, replaced by silence and the occasional nervous glance at one another. They had underestimated her, and the realization was uncomfortable. But the girl didn't notice, and she didn't need to. The music was enough. Her confidence soared. She allowed herself to smile slightly, not at the applause, not at the attention, but because she was enjoying the music. She had taken a step forward into fear and doubt, and now she was thriving. The hall had become her space, her audience her witness, and the piano her voice. Every note she played told a piece of her story, a story of courage, memory, and love. As the melody continued, she added subtle dynamics. Soft passages that whispered like secrets and louder moments that expressed strength and determination. Each variation carried her emotion fully. People in the hall leaned in instinctively, some closing their eyes to absorb it fully. Even the skeptics were caught off guard, unable to ignore the connection she had made with her instrument, and through it, with everyone listening, the girl's hands moved fluidly now, each key pressed with purpose and care. She was no longer hesitant, no longer thinking about the judgment of others. She was fully present in the music, and it responded with richness and beauty that seemed to fill every corner of the hall. She felt a wave of joy pass through her, a sense of accomplishment and freedom that only came when someone fully embraced their passion. Some of the older attendees whispered to each other, astonished at her ability to combine technical skill with emotional depth. "She's extraordinary," one said. "I've never heard someone this young play like that." Another nodded, unable to take his eyes off her hands, marveling at how effortlessly she moved between delicate passages and more powerful chords. The audience's admiration was growing, spreading quietly like a warm current through the hall. The teens were silent now, leaning slightly forward as if trying to catch every note. Their earlier arrogance had disappeared, replaced by quiet amazement. They had expected failure, but instead they saw mastery and confidence. They exchanged glances, unsure how to react. One of them muttered softly, "She's really good," and didn't add anything more, knowing that words could not capture what they had witnessed. The girl didn't stop. She continued to explore the melody, letting it expand and grow naturally. She added subtle variations, changes in tempo and emphasis, that made the piece feel alive, almost as if it were breathing. Each note carried emotion, thought, and intention. The hall was silent except for the sound of the piano, and in that silence, the hall was no longer just a room filled with people. It had transformed into something entirely different. The gentle hum of conversations had vanished, replaced by an almost reverent silence, broken only by the delicate sounds of the piano under the girl's hands. Every corner of the room seemed to vibrate with the music, as if the walls themselves were listening, holding their breath. She sat at the piano, her fingers poised with calm confidence, her eyes lightly tracing the keys as she prepared to continue. The first notes she played this time were soft, almost like a whisper, drawing people in closer. The teens who had once laughed now leaned slightly forward, their expressions unreadable, trying to hide the astonishment on their faces. Some of them bit their lips, others glanced sideways at one another. They had come expecting entertainment, perhaps a few laughs at someone's expense, but what they were seeing now was far from ordinary. The girl was playing with a depth of understanding and emotion that went beyond the surface. Her melody began to grow, swelling gently, rising and falling like waves on a calm sea. She didn't need to glance at the audience. Her focus was entirely on the piano and the music flowing through her. Each note carried intention. Each pause felt like a breath in a larger conversation. The hall seemed to lean with her, captivated, silent except for the sound of the piano. Even the children in the audience, usually restless and distracted, were sitting still, eyes wide. Absorbed completely, the girl allowed herself to add small flourishes, delicate embellishments that had taken years to learn. Her fingers moved gracefully across the keys, hitting the right notes with both precision and feeling. She didn't rush. Each chord, each gentle trill, carried weight and emotion. The music was no longer just a tune. It was a story, and every listener could feel the narrative unfolding around them. Some smiled softly, touched by the innocence and purity of the sound. Others closed their eyes, letting the melody speak directly to their hearts. The teens who had mocked her were shifting uneasily now. They were still standing, but their confidence had waned. One whispered under his breath, "I didn't expect this. She's good." Another nodded, staring intently at her hands as they danced across the keys. The mockery had dissolved entirely, replaced by something they couldn't quite name: curiosity, admiration, maybe even a touch of envy. They had underestimated her, and now they could see that she was in command of something far beyond their understanding. The girl's fingers moved faster now, but with control, letting the melody grow bolder, yet still nuanced. She had found a rhythm, a balance, a flow that made the music feel alive. Each chord resonated with clarity, each pause carried meaning. The audience could feel it in their chests, the vibration of the piano connecting with them, bridging the gap between performer and listener. Some leaned in instinctively, drawn by the subtle power of the music. She began to explore variations of the melody, experimenting with volume and tempo, letting her emotions guide her. There were moments of soft introspection, almost fragile, followed by louder, more confident bursts of energy. Each section told a different part of her story, her doubts, her courage, her memories, her hopes. People watched her hands intently, seeing not only the skill but the intention behind every movement. This wasn't just playing. This was living through music. Parents in the audience whispered softly to each other, eyes wide with amazement. "I've never seen anyone play like this," one said quietly. "It's like she's telling a story with her hands." Another nodded, eyes fixed on the piano, captivated. Even the older musicians in the room, who had played and listened to music for decades, looked impressed. They exchanged glances, silently acknowledging her talent and the way she commanded attention without demanding it. The children, who had been quiet and still, began to sense the emotion in the room. Some tapped their fingers lightly in rhythm with the music. Others whispered to their parents, expressing awe and wonder. The hall, once just a space for a community gathering, had become a shared experience of emotion and beauty. The girls' music connected everyone, creating a moment of unity that was almost tangible. Her confidence continued to build. She allowed herself to smile slightly as she played, not out of vanity, but from the pure joy of creating something meaningful. Her mind was clear, her emotions focused, and her fingers moved effortlessly. Each note reflected not only her skill, but her heart. She remembered her grandfather again, his gentle encouragement, and his belief in her talent. She played as if he were there beside her, guiding her hands, reminding her to trust herself. The teens shifted nervously. They had come to mock, to laugh, to feel superior, but they had found themselves powerless against the music. They leaned forward slightly, unwilling to admit they were captivated, yet unable to tear their eyes away. The girls' performance had surpassed their expectations entirely, leaving them quiet and uncertain. Their previous arrogance had melted away. Replaced with respect, they were not ready to voice. The melody began to reach a more complex stage. She introduced subtle counterpoints, weaving harmony and rhythm in a way that created depth and texture. The hall seemed to hold its breath, following each movement of her fingers. The sound resonated beautifully, filling every corner, touching everyone present. The piano was no longer just an instrument. It was an extension of her spirit, a bridge to the emotions of the audience. The audience's reactions grew more visible. Some were leaning forward, eyes wide and shining. Others closed their eyes, lost in the emotion of the moment. Even the quietest attendees could feel the energy in the room, a connection that transcended words. The teens who had mocked her had stopped whispering entirely. They watched in silence, unable to interrupt or disrupt what was happening. They were witnesses to something far beyond their expectation. The girl's hands moved with grace, confidence, and precision. She let herself explore, to experiment with small flourishes, adding texture and depth. She wasn't concerned about mistakes or judgment. Her focus was entirely on the music and the emotion she wanted to convey. The hall responded naturally, the audience leaning in, drawn to the authenticity of her performance. Each note told a story, each pause created anticipation, each chord reflected honesty that she played with subtle dynamics, shifting from soft whispers to gentle crescendos, allowing the music to breathe and expand. People could sense the rise and fall, the ebb and flow of emotion. Some leaned back, lost in thought, their hearts touched by the story being told. Others were drawn forward, leaning on chairs or standing, eyes fixed on her hands, captivated by the beauty and skill on display. Her performance grew more expressive. She allowed herself to add gentle improvisations, small surprises that kept the music alive and unpredictable. The hall became a space of shared wonder, where the audience could feel the energy of her talent and the story behind it. The music carried emotion without needing words, telling of courage, hope, and the quiet strength of someone who had faced doubt and fear but continued to persevere. The teens were now completely silent. They watched every movement of her fingers, unable to look away. Their previous mockery had vanished entirely, replaced with fascination and reluctant admiration. They whispered to each other in disbelief, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. The girl didn't notice or care about them. She was fully immersed in the music, letting it carry her forward, letting her heart guide her hands. The parents and older attendees were equally captivated. Some whispered softly to each other, expressing wonder and amazement. Others sat in quiet awe, absorbing the depth of the performance. Even those who had been skeptical at the beginning found themselves drawn into the spell she had created. The hall, once filled with chatter and casual activity, had transformed into a space of shared experience and quiet reverence. The girl's fingers danced across the keys with increasing confidence. She explored higher and lower notes, creating layers of sound that were both intricate and emotionally rich. The hall seemed to respond with every vibration, the audience absorbed completely by the music. Even the children were still, some tilting their heads, listening intently, some smiling faintly as they recognized the beauty of the melody. She let herself smile as she played, feeling the music lift her spirits as much as it lifted the audience's. Each note reflected a part of her journey, her doubts, her courage, her memories, and her dreams. She played not for recognition, not for applause, but for the sheer joy of sharing her heart through sound. The hall had become a space of emotion and connection, where everyone could feel the authenticity of her performance. As the music grew more expressive, the audience responded naturally. Some leaned forward, drawn by the subtle intricacies. Others closed their eyes, letting the melodies wash over them, feeling the story unfold in their hearts. Even the teens, still standing at the back, were captivated, their previous arrogance replaced by genuine wonder. They whispered softly among themselves, realizing that they had underestimated her talent entirely. The girl's performance continued, flowing naturally from one section to the next. She explored different textures, tempos, and dynamics, allowing the music to tell a full story. Each note was intentional, each pause meaningful, each chord carrying emotion. The hall seemed to vibrate with her energy, the audience drawn into the acts. The applause continued, rippling through the hall like waves, but the girl remained seated at the piano. She did not rise immediately, nor did she speak. Her hands hovered just above the keys, trembling slightly not from fear, but from the intensity of emotion that had been flowing through her fingertips. The audience, still caught in the magic of what they had witnessed, slowly began to settle, some leaning back in their chairs, others still standing, trying to regain composure. For a moment, the hall was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was not the restless murmuring of casual conversation, nor the whispering of doubt. It was a quiet filled with awe and reflection. People were trying to process what they had just seen and heard. Even the teens who had been mocking her earlier were completely silent, their faces open with astonishment. They could no longer pretend. They had witnessed something remarkable, something that could not be dismissed or laughed at. The girl looked around briefly, seeing faces she did not recognize, yet somehow feeling connected to each person. She saw eyes wide with wonder, some shining with unshed tears, some nodding slowly in appreciation. For the first time in her life, she felt the impact of her music in a public space, feeling the way it could touch people's hearts beyond words. She realized in that moment that the piano had become not just an instrument, but a bridge between her inner world and everyone watching. Slowly, she began to play again. This time, her fingers moved with gentle confidence, exploring the piano with a soft touch, creating notes that were tender, reflective, and full of feeling. She played a melody that spoke of her journey, the uncertainty, the fear, the courage, and the love she had carried with her. Each note seemed to float in the hall, filling the spaces between people, wrapping around them, making them lean in just a little closer, silently listening. The teens at the back shifted uncomfortably. One of them whispered, barely audible, "She's amazing." Another nodded slightly, but no words could fully express what they were feeling. They had expected failure, mockery, or at least mediocrity. Instead, they had been drawn into a world they hadn't expected. A world built by a young girl who had the courage to face doubt and a talent to make her voice heard. The melody grew richer as she played, expanding in depth and emotion. She allowed herself to explore variations in tempo and tone, the music flowing naturally from her mind and heart. Some passages were soft and delicate, almost whispering secrets to the audience. Others were more powerful, carrying strength and determination. The hall seemed to breathe with her, the audience unconsciously leaning in, drawn to the subtleties, caught up in the story she was telling. People whispered quietly among themselves, pointing to the girl with admiration. "I've never heard anyone play like that," one parent said. "It's incredible how much emotion she puts into every note." Another nodded, eyes wide with wonder. "It's like she's telling her life through the piano," they whispered softly, barely daring to break the spell. Others simply sat quietly, captivated, allowing the music to reach into them and stir something deep and unspoken. Even the teens who had mocked her now found themselves unable to turn away. They had come with the intent to judge and ridicule, but they were powerless against what was happening. Their expressions had softened, their postures relaxed, though they still struggled with the admission of admiration. One of them muttered quietly to his friend, I didn't think she could do that." The other simply shook his head, his eyes fixed on her hands. Silent and captivated, the girl noticed the shift, but did not let it distract her. She focused entirely on the piano, letting each note carry her emotion, her memories, and her story. She could feel the connection growing between herself and the audience. It was as if each person was a thread in a tapestry, woven together by the music. She had created something larger than herself, something that touched hearts and connected strangers in a way that words could not. Her fingers moved with increasing freedom now, exploring the full range of the piano, creating melodies that rose and fell, that twisted and turned like a river. The sound filled the hall completely, leaving no corner untouched. People shifted slightly in their seats, leaning forward to catch every nuance, some closing their eyes, letting the music wash over them. There was an almost tangible sense of anticipation in the air, as if the hall itself was waiting to see where the music would take them next. The teens exchanged glances again. Their earlier arrogance had disappeared entirely, replaced with awe and, surprisingly, respect. One whispered softly, "She's really something else." The other nodded slowly, silent, watching intently. They had expected to feel superior, to laugh, but instead they were confronted with talent, courage, and artistry they had not anticipated. It unsettled them, but it also fascinated them. The girl's hands continued to move over the keys, fluid and confident. She began to add subtle ornaments to her melody, small improvisations that made the piece feel alive and spontaneous. Each variation was carefully placed, yet it seemed effortless. The hall responded naturally, the audience leaning in, drawn into the intricacies of the performance. The music spoke to them directly, bypassing language and going straight to the heart. Some of the parents whispered quietly, marveling at the depth and control she displayed. "It's like she's been playing forever," one said. "Her understanding of the piano, it's beyond her age." Another nodded, eyes fixed on the girl's hands, noting the ease and grace with which she moved across the keys. Even the older musicians in the room, who had heard countless performances, looked impressed, exchanging silent acknowledgments of her skill. The children remained captivated as well. Some had been fidgeting earlier, but now they were still, absorbed. A few whispered to their parents, expressing wonder at the beauty of what they were hearing. Some tapped their fingers lightly on the floor, feeling the rhythm in their small, innocent way. The hall had become a space where everyone, regardless of age or expectation, was connected through the music. The girl's performance grew more expressive. She allowed herself to explore both the highs and lows of emotion, moving from soft, introspective passages to powerful, assertive ones. She played with courage, with love, with memory, and with the knowledge that she had overcome doubt to reach this moment. Each note was deliberate, carrying meaning and intention, and the audience could feel it. They were part of something special, a moment that would linger in their memories long after the last note faded. The teens had stopped whispering entirely. They were completely absorbed, watching every movement of her hands, noticing every subtle detail of her playing. Their earlier laughter and arrogance had vanished, replaced by quiet astonishment. They had underestimated her, and now they were forced to acknowledge that talent and courage were far more powerful than mockery. Even if they didn't admit it out loud, they had learned something in those few minutes. Never judge someone before seeing what they can do. The girl's confidence was at its peak now. She allowed herself to smile slightly, not because of the attention, but because of the joy she felt in the music itself. She had faced fear, doubt, and ridicule, and she had created something beautiful. She felt alive in a way she never had before. The piano was not just an instrument anymore. It was a partner, a voice, a means to express everything that she had held inside. The hall seemed to respond to her energy. The audience was leaning forward, completely engaged, sung with tears glistening in their eyes. The music had become more than notes and rhythm. It was emotion made audible, a story told without words, a connection made between a performer and every single listener. People whispered quietly to one another, amazed at the depth and honesty of what they were experiencing. The teens were still standing at the back, silent and captivated. One of them whispered softly, almost in disbelief, I didn't know someone could play like that." The other nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the girl's hands. They had come intending to mock, but they were learning a lesson in humility, in respect, and in the power of talent. The girl did not notice them, nor did she need to. She was fully present, fully immersed, and fully herself. She continued, exploring new variations, improvising gently, letting the music evolve naturally. Each note reflected her courage, her memories, and her love for the piano. The audience could feel the emotion flowing through the hall, each listener connecting in their own way. Some closed their eyes, letting the melody touch their hearts. Others leaned in, fascinated by the skill and precision of her performance. Even the skeptical attendees could not resist the magic of what she was creating. Her fingers danced across the keys, exploring the full range of the piano. She moved from delicate, whispering passages to strong, expressive chords, allowing the music to tell a complete story. The hall was filled with sound, energy, and emotion, and everyone was caught in it, united by the power of her performance. The audience felt the depth, the passion, and the honesty of her playing, realizing that they were witnessing something rare and extraordinary. When she finally ended the piece, the hall remained silent for a heartbeat. The last chord lingered in the air, soft and resonant, leaving behind a feeling of awe and wonder. Then applause erupted. It was louder than before, heartfelt and genuine. People stood, clapped, and cheered. EXP. The hall was filled with energy, but it was no longer loud or chaotic. It was the quiet buzz of admiration, of people still absorbing what they had just experienced. The girl remained at the piano, her hands resting lightly on the keys, her eyes reflecting a mix of exhaustion and fulfillment. She could feel her heartbeat slowing, her breathing settling, but the connection she had made with the room lingered. Every face she saw carried awe, wonder, or a soft smile, and it made her feel both humbled and alive. For a moment, she just sat there, letting the silence wash over her. The audience was still processing, some whispering to each other softly, pointing to the girl in amazement. The teens who had mocked her earlier were standing at the back, no longer trying to hide their astonishment. Their expressions were a mixture of awe, disbelief, and reluctant respect. They had come to ridicule, to feel superior, but they had witnessed something that left them speechless. For once, they had nothing to say. Slowly, the girl began to play again, but this time with a gentle, deliberate softness. She didn't need to perform. She didn't need to impress. She was sharing something personal, something true. Each note carried her emotions, her story, and her heart. The melody was simple but full of life, delicate yet expressive, like a message sent quietly to every listener. People leaned in instinctively, as if to catch every nuance, feeling the honesty and depth of her music. The music flowed effortlessly from her, a natural extension of herself. Her fingers moved across the keys with grace and control, exploring small variations, adding subtle flourishes that made the piece feel alive and unique. She was not thinking of the audience, not thinking of their reaction, not thinking of the teens or the parents. She was fully present in the music, letting it guide her and express everything that she carried inside. The hall responded to her in a way she had never experienced before. The energy was soft, almost invisible, yet powerful. People were leaning in, some closing their eyes to absorb every note. Others whispered softly to their neighbors, trying to articulate what they were feeling. "It's like she's telling a story without words," one said quietly. "I can feel what she's feeling," another whispered. Even the musicians in the audience, who had played and heard music for decades, nodded in quiet respect, impressed by her control, emotion, and expression. The teens at the back shifted uncomfortably. They had expected a simple, perhaps mediocre performance. They had expected to laugh, to feel superior. But they had been wrong. They were now completely silent, watching every movement of her hands, trying to understand how someone so young could create something so beautiful. One of them whispered, almost to himself, I've never seen anyone play like that." The other nodded silently, eyes wide, still captivated by the music. They were learning humility in a way they hadn't expected. The girl's melody continued to grow richer. She began to add dynamics, soft passages that felt like secrets being shared, and louder sections that carried power and strength. The music was alive, breathing with her, echoing through the hall, touching every listener differently. Some smiled softly, moved by the beauty. Others felt a quiet stirring in their hearts, a connection that words could not capture. The music had become more than sound, it was a feeling, a shared experience, a story that everyone in the hall was part of. Her confidence soared. She allowed herself to play more boldly, exploring the full range of the piano. High notes sparkled, delicate and clear. Low notes rumbled, strong and resonant. The hall vibrated with sound, but it was controlled, precise, and beautiful. Each chord carried emotion. Each pause created anticipation. Each sequence told a story. The audience was completely absorbed, forgetting about themselves, forgetting about time, caught entirely in the moment she had created. Even the children, who had been quiet and captivated since the beginning, now looked mesmerized. Some tapped their fingers softly in rhythm with the music, almost unconsciously. Others whispered to their parents, expressing their wonder in small, innocent voices. The hall had become a space of shared admiration, a quiet unity where people of all ages were connected by the music and the story the girl was telling. The teens remained silent, but the effect of her performance was clear. They had come to mock, to feel superior, and to provoke laughter, but now they were powerless, witnessing talent and emotion that left them unsure what to say. Their expressions softened, their posture changed, and they could not turn away. It was as if the music had claimed their attention and left them with no choice but to acknowledge its power. The girl's fingers danced across the keys with skill and grace. She allowed herself to add subtle improvisations, variations that were not planned but felt entirely natural. The melody shifted gently, exploring emotions and memories she had kept hidden, allowing the audience to experience them alongside her. Each note carried a part of her journey: fear, courage, doubt, hope, and the joy of sharing something she loved deeply. The audience responded instinctively. Some leaned forward, their eyes wide, captivated. Others closed their eyes, feeling the music wash over them. Whispers of admiration floated quietly through the hall. "She's incredible," one said. "I can't believe someone this young can play with such depth." Another nodded silently, completely absorbed, letting the notes carry emotions she could not express in words. The teens were still at the back, standing and watching. Their expressions had changed entirely. The arrogance and mockery they had carried had disappeared, replaced by respect, astonishment, and even a hint of envy. They whispered softly to each other, trying to articulate what they felt, but words were insufficient. All they could do was watch, captivated, learning an unspoken lesson about talent, courage, and the power of self-expression. The girl's music reached its peak, both in skill and in emotion. She allowed herself to explore the full range of the piano, high and low notes, delicate melodies, and bold chords. The sound was immersive, rich, and full of life. The hall seemed to vibrate in response, the audience completely absorbed, every ear and heart tuned to the story she was telling. Some listeners closed their eyes completely, letting themselves feel the music in their entire being. Others leaned forward, captivated by her technique and the beauty of each note. Her playing was no longer just a performance. It was an act of courage, a declaration of her love for music, and a gift to the audience. Every note carried intention and honesty. Every chord conveyed emotion. Every pause created anticipation and reflection. The audience was no longer separate from her. They were part of the story, connected by the music she had summoned from her heart. Even the teens were visibly moved. One of them whispered softly, I never expected this." The other nodded, still staring at her hands. They had come intending to mock, but they had learned something powerful: never judge someone before seeing their full potential. The girl did not notice them. She did not need to. She was fully immersed in the music, letting it flow naturally and fully, without fear or hesitation. The audience began to respond more openly. Hands clapped gently at first, growing in volume as people expressed their admiration. Some stood, giving her a standing ovation. Others wiped tears from their eyes. The hall was filled with appreciation, not just for skill, but for courage, emotion, and authenticity. People whispered to each other, sharing their awe quietly. "She's amazing," one said. "Her music, it speaks to the soul." Another nodded in agreement, eyes still on her hands. "I've never felt anything like this in a performance before." The girl smiled softly, her heart full. She had faced doubt, mockery, and fear, and she had transformed them into something beautiful. She had shared her music honestly, fully, and courageously. She had shown that talent and heart, combined with determination, could create something that touched people deeply. Her performance had left a mark, not just in the hall, but in the hearts of everyone present. She played the final notes gently, allowing them to linger in the air, soft but full of presence. The last chord resonated through the hall, clear and beautiful, a perfect ending to the story she had told. For a moment, there was complete silence, everyone holding their breath, feeling the echo of her music settle in the room. Then, applause erupted, louder and more heartfelt than anything before. People stood, clapped, cheered, and some even wept quietly, moved by the experience. The teens at the back finally clapped, their expressions a mix of respect and astonishment. They had witnessed something extraordinary, and even though they had begun with ridicule, they could not deny the beauty and courage they had seen. Their lesson was clear. Talent and heart can overcome doubt and mockery, and the most unexpected people can create the most remarkable moments. The girl rose slowly from the piano, her hands brushing lightly over the keys one last time. She smiled at the audience, a quiet, humble smile, knowing she had given everything she had. The hall was alive with admiration, connection, and awe. She had started with uncertainty, faced mockery, and ended with triumph. She had not just played the piano. She had shared her heart, and everyone had felt it. Even after the applause began to fade, People remained in their seats, reluctant to leave the moment behind. They whispered to each other, recounting the beauty of her performance. The teens lingered, exchanging glances, clearly affected. Parents, children, and older musicians